Oh, yeah. Feeling the burn today, gang. Feeling the burn. Gonna have to do
Finally
some
awake.
warm-ups. I have to start doing some stretches or something, some warm-ups before we do that. Dancing, that's a lot once a week. Hey, thanks everybody for joining us this week on Instructional Designers in Offices Drinking Coffee, brought to you by us good folks here at Domino, which includes my colleague, Dr. Paul Schneider. Paul, how are things in your hood? You're at the you're in a different hood this week.
I am. I have just finished attending ATD ICE in Washington, D.C., staring out at lots of rain coming down. It was a beautiful day all week long until today. But I guess that's why we're inside doing a podcast here. But yeah, it was a great show. Lots of folks out there and lots of talk about the types of things that we're going to be talking about today, which is very apropos.
For sure. Gang, we have Margie Meacham with us here today. Margie, I know you've been with us before, but for folks who haven't met you yet, give us an introduction to yourself and some of the things that you do and you focus on.
Oh, okay, sure. Well, I'm an instructional designer by training and trade, and what I got interested in about 10 years ago was how the fields of neuroscience and artificial intelligence were helping each other, converging, and how there's so many tools from the AI side and insights from neuroscience that we can use. And so I really made it my focus to not only do that in my own work, but to tell other people how we can do that. And speaking of ATD, I've been there many times doing that same thing. It's great to connect with everybody in the profession and share best practices. And of course, right now, these topics are really hot. One thing I think gets a little lost sometimes is the learning science behind how we use these tools. And, just because you can do something or make something look good or, splashy doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be effective. So that is why I like to talk about both topics at the same time. And at the end of this, I recommend that you all download the slides because there are links to, resources. I'm going to mention a few. We're going to get a little geeky because that's also part of who I am. I love the science behind it. And I think we're going to also have some fun because if learning isn't fun, it's not effective. And so I love the way you guys always start with the dance. That gets us in the right mood.
Body and mind is how I think of the dance.
Your brain's in your
actually some
body.
Great science. Yeah, some great science behind that too. As far as keeping your mind healthy, it's keeping your body healthy is a big thing. As those of us who are getting older.
Awesome. So, where do we want to begin?
Well, I have a little slide presentation and a demonstration that you guys are going to help me with. So do you want me to just jump right in and let's get started?
Yeah.
Please do, yeah.
Okay. All right. So enhancing learning and performance. That's a big topic.
He's falling, everybody in the office knows he's sleeping with her, and that promotion. She doesn't have a clue what she's doing. It's just a matter of time before she screws up big time. And did you see that speech she gave to the shareholders last week? Seriously,
I
This
told
city
you
council
Hello,
election
this
go
is
ahead,
way
go
better
dance,
than
toddle,
the
shake it,
bullshit.
dance,
While everyone else is
toddle,
talking,
We told the voters
it's just a little
we've
bit
mapped a
bigger
plan to
picture.
flip the state house next term,
My guy has
but we're going to need
37
several
new
key
lots.
influencers to
They're
get
all
things
prepped
started.
and ready to go.
What we're really looking
We're
for
just
right
waiting
now
on
are
a
people
few
who
of the
can help us
permits.
get out the vote.
And by the time we get
At the
those
local
through,
level,
we'll
it's
have the
all about who
thermostats
you
in
know.
from Vietnam.
And you, my dear,
Now
know
you can get in
everyone.
on our pre-building offer. The ROI is going to be absolutely sick on these first few units.
Okay.
Margie, there were a
Yes.
lot of voices in my head there.
Yeah.
But I know I need to get
and
out the
I'm sorry
vote.
for bringing that on you guys, but that's what life does to you, right? In fact, if you just came back from a conference, that's the expo floor, right? And
Yeah.
it's a cacophony of input, and your brain is getting that all the time. That's what it sounds like inside your head, and we have to learn how to filter that, and that's part of what our brains do since childhood. I'm starting with this because it really makes the point of how different AI works from the brain we're all more used to, the human brain. So as you were listening, you might have heard an argument, somebody else pushing a business opportunity about real estate, somebody else talking about politics. I mean, who doesn't these days? And depending on where you are at right now in your life, for example, right now we're shopping for a new home, which is kind of a crazy time right now to be doing that. But, so anytime I hear anyone talk about real estate, my ears pick up and I hear that conversation. Other people might have been more interested in some of the business conversations that were going on, or they might have been interested in something else. There's actually a couple of conversations that almost nobody hears, which I find interesting when I play this. And of course, it's engineered to let you hear certain conversations. There's pauses in the cocktail party. And suddenly one person is speaking to the whole crowd, and that might not be what they intended. So what this is a demonstration of what we call the cocktail party problem. And I've got a link for you down below. This is a classic study that talks about the challenge we have as humans when we need to focus. And the reason that's important is because no learning takes place until our brains pay attention to a stimuli. So background thing, this is why trying to learn while you sleep and playing an audiobook while you sleep does not work the way people think it does. Because when you are truly asleep, you are not listening to outside stimuli. Let me just hide. Sorry, getting a little tip from my producer there. So what we want to do is we want to help people pay attention in this crazy world. And that is how we're going to use artificial intelligence a little bit differently than most people see, as a tool, as something that helps us filter out the noise rather than add to it. And to do that, we need to take a little bit of time looking at how humans learn and then compare and contrast that with how AI learns, which is a whole different use of the word, but we'll get into that. So taking a look at how humans learn, these are really in order. So if you start at the left, the first thing happened with your brains when you were suddenly hit with that onslaught of noise. In addition to, you're looking at this screen, you're looking at the text, you're maybe jumping to that link. Thank you very much for sharing that. And you're, looking at the video and wondering what in the heck is playing, what am I hearing, and trying to make sense of it. That is your nervous system detecting all that stimuli. Now those signals are moving through the neural pathways you already have in your brain to specific areas of the brain. That's what this picture is trying to show. That tell you is visual, is it? The reason I picked auditory stimuli is simply because it's one of the easiest to simulate for the purposes today. And the brain had to decide, what am I paying attention to? So at first, you might have blocked out some of those conversations while you were figuring out what's going on. And then one or two started to emerge into your consciousness. And that's when you start to select, what are you paying attention to? And notice something under selection and filtering, that our brains are programmed to pay the most attention to anything that impacts our survival. Your brain is a survival machine, first and foremost. That's why we learn. We learn because it helps us survive. Now, that's a little different than AI. And if it ever starts filtering information based on its own survival, we will have achieved general intelligence. That'll be a truly sentient being, because that's why live creatures do. They make choices based on their own survival. A lot of people think that could be a very scary and dangerous time for us. So let's hope we're not there, and we're not there yet. So your brain may have paid more attention to real estate because your financial survival might depend on that right now. Or you might have had a political interest, or you might have looked at internal office politics because something like that is happening in your world. That's what that survival programming does for your brain. It starts to filter things that seem to be the most important to you. So personalized learning starts with every stimulus. Our learning is personalized already because our brains do that for us. What we can do as designers is we can help focus that attention the way we want to. And we have to integrate it, which is the next thing that happens, to the rest of what we know about the world. I love, and by the way, music really helps you focus and helps tell the brain what it should be paying attention to. We could do another whole session on that. If the brain weights this information and recognizes there might be something here I want to remember. Now, if I were really at a cocktail party, for example, and I heard someone talking about AI, that might get my attention. I might even navigate over to that conversation, and I might remember that. So this is how your brain works and processes information, and eventually decides, consciously or unconsciously, that I'm going to retain this information, which is when those new neural pathways get formed. Now, Claude is similar to ChatGPT. It's a large language model. It's gaining a lot more attention these days. I've been using it for years, and it's my tool of choice. But I took these individual scripts that I had written to create that file, and I fed them to Claude. And then I asked Claude to identify the themes, and it listed those things we saw on the previous slide. There's real estate, there's politics, there's an argument, and so on. And then I asked her, well, how did you do that? And here's what Claude told me. First, it processed all the inputs at once. Instead of focusing on one or another conversation, it focused them all at once and converted them into numbers, because that's how it thinks. By the way, that's a step our brains do too. We'll talk about that in a minute. Then it decided which parts were most relevant by picking up individual scores of those numeric representations. That's how Claude and ChatGPT and all the others read. Yes, ROI was a common theme that came from multiple voices, even though they didn't all use the term ROI. And so that's a good observation. That was one of the themes coming up. And so you're highly tuned to that. because we're all, in business, and right now we're in a business setting. If we had been on the beach listening to a similar background of conversations and we were in a different frame of mind, we might not have keyed in on that as much.
I was just thinking, being in DC, the get out the vote seemed really loud compared to the rest of the talking. So, and I know it wasn't that much more volume wise.
I actually just sort of randomly picked a few topics I thought would be on people's minds. And it's very regionally and timing specific, and what's happening. Yeah, what's happening in your world affects that. Now think about that. You've got a classroom full of people, and you're trying to teach them one thing, and all this is going on, in the background. What are they actually paying attention to? You, or the conversation down the hall, or something they heard on the radio on the way in? And we're fighting all of that. Now, our AI tools are able to focus on exactly what we tell them to focus on. And so what they can do is sort through all those inputs, and they can identify distinctive phrases like ROI, they can key terms, and then look for those patterns. That's how it identifies themes, clusters them together, and then transforms them back. That's what the word transformer comes from. Transforms them back into text, into a human language, so that it's useful to us. So it does work very differently. And there's a really important, I already gave you the cocktail party research. This is a seminal work on AI called Attention is All You Need. It was the beginning of the world we have today, where you can actually simply type in a text prompt or a voice prompt to one of your large language model tools. It will create an image, it will create a spreadsheet, it will answer a question, it will search the web if it's able to do that. And notice all the people from Google who were part of that paper. Even if all you read is the abstract, I think it's a great background for what's happening here. And that paper explained how large language models were supposed to work. Now, that's enough. That's as geeky as I get. Now, the rest of this is practical application and how we can use this. First of all, let's take a look at what is similar about the human brain and these large language models. The first is they both use math. Even if you think you're terrible at math, your brain is a statistical genius, because here's what it is constantly doing. It is taking in all that stimuli, and it is processing it against your previous experience, what you know about the world, and it is pulling out things that are likely to be important with that background of survival. Now, in today's world, survival often is more financial or social or political, which is why I chose those kind of themes to be going on in that mix of conversations. So don't think of it only as life and death, although certainly your brain is really good at recognizing potential threats. As a matter of fact, right before we started, I have two little dogs that I sometimes let join me on these things, but their survival mode, their brains are 94% the same as ours. They saw an animal outside, and of course, that heightened their survival mechanism, and I couldn't get them off that focus. So they're in the next room driving my husband crazy right now because there's birds in the yard. But, that's a dog's life. But our life's not that much different. You see a big distractor like that, it's pretty hard to pay attention to the screen. There's probably at least one person listening right now who has something going on that is making it hard to pay attention. So your brain ranks all the stimuli that are coming in and decides which one is most important to pay attention to based on the likelihood of what happens next. So it is predicting the immediate future based on all the past. And both AI and our human brains do that. The next thing they do, and remember Claude described this, it looks for meaning through context. And when we say it builds models, in your head, you have a view of how the world works. That's a model. And Claude has a view of how the world works. It's very limited. Its experience is different than mine. And every person's model is different because we all come from different backgrounds. We share some things, but we also have things that are different in our experiences. We also are looking at multiple inputs at once. Now, parallel processing is not the same as multitasking. The human brain can only really do one thing at a time, but it alternates so quickly that it's able to process multiple things at the same time. So you can be looking at a screen, you can be hearing a sound, you can have that crazy mix of sounds and actually jump from conversation to conversation, depending on which one you want to tune in on. And that would still be called parallel processing. Now, how AI does it is different. It just does it all at once, same time. It has the computing power to do that. And another very important thing we want to consider are priming, which is everything that led up to this. Now, before we started, you had to register for this. So you guys probably knew, we're going to talk about neuroscience. We're going to talk about AI. We're going to talk about learning. That primed you, maybe with questions, maybe with things you're interested in. Maybe you've seen one of my talks before and you were curious, or maybe you didn't. Maybe you said, who the heck is this woman? I'm not doing anything right now. I'll have my coffee and I'll join in. So it depends on your immediate experience, how you were primed. Lots of educators forget that the learning process begins the moment someone knows they are going to learn something. So registration, publication of your event, the description, all of those things are extremely valuable, and we don't want to leave them to chance. So, for example, how you engage that learner, what the experience is like, and this is something you folks at Domino know a lot about, how easy is the LMS to use? What was the registration experience like? Did it tell people what to expect? Though that's when the learning starts. That's not just, advertising or useful information. That is priming the pathways that will then be used to capture that information. And so we have to think about that learning experience from the very beginning and past what the actual webinar is. For example, you guys are going to have access to links, to slides, to the recording. Your learning is still going on. That learning process continues and continues to build from there. And people will go and apply this, and that will build more pathways. So priming is extremely important and often forgotten. All of that AIs do too.
And RJ,
training. Yes, go ahead.
Thinking about that and how many times I've seen that in both real world and even my recent experience with AI. I had a colleague who sometimes he was explaining something, he got off track, he's like, stop, let me start again. And he was kind of like resetting there. Or how I've heard people say, oh, that content was really confusing to navigate. And then it was from a different LMS. And then they said, oh, it's super easy. And it was the priming of particular LMS was hard to get there. Or even I've been doing some ChatGPT things, Claude things, and I'd be going down a road and I didn't explain things quite right to the engine, and it was just getting it wrong and getting worse as I try to do it. And I just abandoned that conversation, started a new one, which fortunately it was easy to fully reset the computer. And I was able to get the answer from them very quickly, where I was getting nowhere because of the poor priming that I had.
That's right. That's a great example, because prompt engineering is the new programming for most of us. Most of us will never need to know how to code, because we'll be able to simply tell our large language models what we want. But there's an art to it. And it turns out they're very much like people. They need context, they need background, they need expectations, they need to understand who's going to consume what you're asking me to produce. The more context you get, the better result you get. And most of us are learning that through trial and error, just like you talk about there, Paul, is, oh, that didn't get me what I want, let me try again. And that's a perfect example of priming. We are often repurposing concepts that we learned in psychology, or we learned somewhere in a training class that we took. We learned them to apply to human learners, but they are relevant to how we interact with AI as well. And that's both good news, because it means we probably all know a little more about AI than we think we know, but it also is potentially dangerous because not everything translates. So you can't assume, oh, people are this way, ChatGPT probably is too. So let's take a look at some of the differences. So the difference between working with an entity that has been, and I choose these words very carefully, explicitly programmed to operate in a certain way, is very different than a biological structure and combination of structures, our brains, that evolved over millions, thousands of, well, I say millions of years because it started with a little amoeba. And of course, the human brain, we're talking thousands and thousands of brains. So that means there are certain things AI just does better than us, like being able to listen to all the conversations at once and sort through them without missing anything and not be confused and identify that ROI theme and some other things going on. But there's other things it doesn't do nearly as well, like emotional context, making a leap to a completely new train of thought, although they're getting better every day. And I see that even in my own work. For example, I was brainstorming with Claude when I knew I was going to give this talk. And so I asked Claude, what do you think we ought to cover? And it surprised me with several suggestions I wouldn't have thought of. And some of them I used and some of them I didn't. But they're definitely getting better in that regard. Now, if you, one of the concerns about all of this is that AI has a huge carbon footprint and is not helping the planet. And that's something we're all going to have to face and deal with. It takes a lot more energy. There are some ideas, there are some promising things that we're working on. The human brain is one of the most remarkably efficient tools, if you want to think of it that way. The other thing that I think is important for us to remember when we look at our learners is that when they evaluate that pattern, remember we talked about how everyone interpreted that mix of conversations differently. And the same is true of human beings. Every learner chooses. That's why all learning is personalized, because every learner makes it so. We choose what's important, what we care about, what we're going to remember. If you write something down, you immediately are making a choice. That's important to me. I want to remember it. And you're more likely to remember it because you engaged muscles, you engaged more neural pathways in order to write. And by the way, handwriting uses an analog path. It requires a lot more brain power to write by hand. Therefore, you remember things you write by hand. And cursive is more memorable than printing for the same reason, which is why it's very unfortunate that in a lot of school systems today, people aren't being taught to write cursive. It's a very efficient note-taking tool, but that's a side issue. We'll come back and talk about all that some other time. Those are examples of human personalization that you don't get. You can tell ChatGPT or Claude to remember you, and I do, and remember who I am and what its role is. And I'm very careful to say it because a lot of times I slip up and say he when I talk about my buddy Claude. And I'm aware he's not a person. But boy, our human desire for connection makes everything have a personality. If you've ever said that your car is stubborn or your computer doesn't like you today, that's your human brain finding another being even where there isn't one. And we do it all the time. The shapes we see in the clouds, possibly some of the interpretations I put on my wonderful dogs might be just me putting a human context on it. Although I personally believe that we're going to find out that our animal cousins are far more intelligent than we're giving them credit for. But again, we'll do that. We'll talk about that another time. And
I don't think they smile like we think they do.
Yes. Yeah. And the human attention just can go so many different ways. AI has to do what we have built it for. Now, with a caveat, when ChatGPT first came out, it was intended really just to give us humans an interface to tell it what we want it to do. And so that's why it's a language processing tool, because that democratized AI. Now we can all work with it. We don't have to be programmers. We can just talk to, and it does that translation into numbers and into algorithms and understands what we're asking. And again, I use that word understand carefully because an AI understands a little differently than a human. But when we put that language in, when ChatGPT was designed and the algorithms were written, it was intended for that, to manage interacting with human language. One thing that was a nice, happy surprise is it also became extremely good at writing code, because that's a language. And the human creators had not considered that. And so sometimes the specialization gets broader than was intended because of how the constraints were defined are not the same as the AI defines itself. So let's take a look at how this might work in real life. And I thought I'd just put a recommended, a little training challenge we see all the time. And then we'll just kind of chat and see what people come up with as a couple of ideas. And I have to ask any of my Domino folks here, I'm seeing the chat, but I'm not seeing it scroll. Oh, I found it. The scroll bar is just a little hard to see, but you guys might have to, chime in and tell me what people are saying. So take a look at this scenario. So we've got people who they should know what they're doing with this new CRM system. We've certainly given them opportunities to learn it, but they keep going back to their old habits, all that tribal knowledge that employees love, and we trainers fight all the time because it's not always accurate. And there's a lot of neuroscience going on here, but we also might be able to use AI to help us break through. And so let's think about, how can we do that? How can we get people to really embrace this new system? And so my challenge to you is to think about, how can you design a learning experience that's going to help those humans accept a new system and really explore it and use it. And I'll just look for some ideas, either from the folks who are with us live or any of my Domino friends here, Paul or Chris, if you guys want to jump in.
Well, I'm not quite sure how to tackle this one, but I'm thinking of typical situations like that. Usually it's because someone is learning from someone else in the organization or someone else there, and they usually are a senior person in terms of time they've been with it. So they're more likely to not even seek out that training because they already know how to do it efficiently, because in their brain they've created that pattern And of course, they're perpetuating that knowledge. Now that you have the new way, it's almost like understanding where is it coming from, who are the leads, and how you can go ahead and bring that in. Catherine just pointed out scenario exercises, and that made me think, oh, you could have a scenario that shows the old kind of way and compares it to the new way, and feeds back to that, or even feed that scenario, both scenarios, into the AI to go ahead and kind of explain how one works fine, but here's why it might not be as good.
Yeah, that's right. Those are a couple of great ideas. So, the idea of a champion, a human champion. Remember, too, we were talking earlier about how our brains kind of create humans where there even aren't any. So you can use that social learning within the context of using an AI tool. You can create a chatbot who has a friendly coworker persona, or if you want to take more of that senior leader persona, and that becomes the source of your tips and your examples and suggestions. Oh, what are you trying to do? Well, I see you're trying to create a new entry for a new customer. Would you like some help? Well, where would you like to start? And you have a chatbot guide them through, as opposed to typical job aids or something they learned in training class. And the chatbot can respond to every user as that user needs them to respond. So somebody who's really experienced, in your example, Paul, they maybe only need help with a few of the advanced things. Somebody who's brand new and a little intimidated by the new system, and maybe even emotionally unhappy that they had to get a new system, because that affects our learning. That's another thing that AIs are sadly and sometimes happily free of, is they don't have those emotions. So, it doesn't get in the way of the AI, but the chatbot can recognize what we call sentiment or human feelings by the context of how we express ourselves. So if you type a question that is very task focused, you will get a different answer than if you throw in emotional content with it. If you say, I can't understand how to use this stupid system, and I'm on a deadline, and I need to get this information entered, you're going to get a different response from that chatbot than if you say just the facts. And depending on what you're looking for, if you go ahead and express yourself emotionally, that might be exactly what you need to help you talk you down a little and walk you through it, just like a human coach would do. So that contextual understanding can be very powerful in helping every individual. That's probably the most exciting thing about it, is that the exchange is different for every individual. So pairing this learning experience and all the other training you've given people so far with a coach, it would be great if it could be a human coach, but since it probably can't be for everybody, a chatbot is a pretty close second, and it's always there. So that's one thing.
Saw in the dialogue here, someone said role plays, and that kind of made me think, if you're trying to move that learning to the next level, of course, for those of us who have taught things, sometimes we decided to teach something because we really wanted to learn about it. So we knew that if we could teach it, then we really know it. And I was thinking you could almost use those role plays in a reverse of, now that you feel like you've mastered it, let's go talk to your potential colleagues that are under those situations you described there, to help steer them in the right way for that too.
Yeah, that's one of the best ways to learn. Just a personal story that my older sister back in school, I think they still do spelling bees, right? The National Spelling Bee. Well, she really wanted to compete for that. And so I helped her study. And guess who won the school spelling bee? The one who was helping. Yeah, because, I knew what the right answers were. And I was, telling her, spell this word, spell that word. And unconsciously, my brain was reinforcing all of that. So she never forgave me for that. But that's the old adage, if you want to learn something really well, teach it. And one of my heroes in learning, Richard Feynman, always said that. As if he always told, and he taught, nuclear physics and aerospace science, and that's what he taught his college students was learn how to teach it to someone else, explain it to one of your liberal arts major friends, and then you understand it. So what I had put up here are a few questions to get you thinking about, now that we have these tools, the biggest challenge is how do we use them, right? Unfortunately, a lot of times we're not seeing that they can be deeply integrated, that these AI tools can be deeply integrated into the learning experience. And chatbot's an easy one, but it can be used to create, you mentioned role playing. If you haven't done this yet, I encourage you to do this. Go to your tool of choice. It can be ChatGPT, it can be Claude. Try a couple, see which one you think is best. And say, I need to develop 3 scenarios that will reinforce this content. Upload your content and see what kind of practice scenarios you get. I am typically very impressed with the realism, the number of options that come out. And this is all coming directly out of the model, and I don't have to think it up. All I have to do now is tweak it and fine tune it and figure out, is that right for my audience? And if I give that tool feedback and say, well, these are adult learners, what you've done is a little too basic for them, or these are senior managers, so give me a different scenario, it will do that. And so you very quickly get a lot of different choices. So take a look at how you could do that. Excuse me. So this is something that you'll want to just look at more deeply. I don't need to read it to you, but here are some things you can do. And I'm going to have to drink my coffee since we're all drinking coffee. Trying to keep another thing a human AI never has to do is get a sore throat or sneeze. But I actually have cloned my voice for some of my work. And I learned that if I let it copy some of my idiosyncrasies, it's much more realistic. So don't make your AI too perfect if you really want people to relate to it. So take a look at what we can do with neurosciences. First of all, if I really wanted to talk about the ROI conversation and the guy who's trying to sell the real estate plots, maybe I need to zero in on that conversation. Maybe I need to deaden some of that background noise. That would be reducing competing stimuli, focus. And most of us, we're pretty good at doing that. If you're in a noisy environment, whether that's emotional noise, for example, if people are under a lot of uncertainty, well, I have a job next week, not a good time to teach them a new system. You might want to focus on some core skills that they'll recognize as translatable anyway. Signal importance. Now, what we mean by this, that's kind of a technical term. It means using stimuli cues like bold. I have bold, so oh, those are the key terms, right? I have a brain to tell you this is the neuroscience stuff, this is the AI stuff, the networky image. By the way, I asked Copilot for a recommendation. What would what would represent AI to people? And that's what it came up with. Looks a little bit like a few logos. So I'm not sure if that was really entirely kosher, but that's what we got. And give people, human brains need to rest. They need breaks especially with something new. When you're teaching something like a new system, there's both physical fatigue and mental fatigue. So people need breaks. So that's why it's so great to have self-paced training, because they can pace themselves, and they will. Now, how can I add AI into the mix? Well, one thing I can do is I can actually use the AI to recognize what people are paying attention to and that allows my system to maybe give them more of what they're looking at. So if they have, and you've all seen this in recommender systems, that's a very simple example, but we can drill down and make that much more specific. But if I see somebody working in a system and I am the human coach, I would realize the next step is X. I'm going to tell them now how to do that next step. The system does the same thing. The AI can recognize that same thing by the human actions, by the questions it's asking. And so we can personalize where they need to focus to learn how to do it for themselves. Also, AI is great. It's always on. It's always there. You've got a little chatbot window at the bottom. Anytime they need help, they can ask for it. So add that just-in-time support and make sure learners know it's there and how to use it. And you also, the other great thing that's going on with AI is it's tracking absolutely everything your user does. And so you can run reports that tell you what's working, what isn't, where are people having trouble. Maybe the way people have to get started on this new CRM system is the big stumbling block because it's significantly different than what they did before. So you'll learn that by really looking at your analytics. So don't ignore the back end because that's how you improve. So now I've allowed a little bit of time for questions, and I want to see if we have any questions people want to talk about, and then we'll wrap it up and see where we go from here. So,
I just was going to say, while we were waiting for questions, if anybody has some in there, this has been fascinating, Margie. As you said in the beginning, I've been beginning to geek out on it, and it's really given me some ideas about how maybe even just to approach differently how you ask the questions of folks, not folks, I should say, of the AI folks or AI its, if you will, on there, and why some of the things that maybe I was asking were working better than other ways. So.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's practice, it's trial and error, and it's different depending on the model. So I talk to ChatGPT and Copilot differently than I talk to Claude. And it's because of what I've learned from my purposes. So I tend to use everything other than Claude for a very specific task I know it's good at. And I use Claude more like my general assistant. Hey, Claude, I'm thinking of doing this. Let's do a little research together. What trends are you seeing now that it can actually use the internet in real time? That was a big improvement. And of course, they're all improving all the time. But that changed things. That made it, much more useful to me.
Speaking of,
yes.
Since you mentioned that, is there, and I don't think we need to go in a lot, but is there one example of you're like, oh, when I want to do X, I definitely pick ChatGPT over Claude? You gave a good example of when you want to use Claude over that, but
yeah, ChatGPT is a whole lot better in Excel and spreadsheets, in my opinion. Now, maybe somebody else knows a better way to prompt it, because here we go.
At least
with
today,
our
right?
We're all different. Our experience has been different, but also if I need something formatted, I tell Claude what I want, but it looks good on the screen. But then when I copy it, I get all kinds of little code symbols, and I always have to clean it up. And so I find ChatGPT better for that. Copilot, I think, does, for my purposes, I don't need to go pay for an expensive image generator. I use Copilot. The only thing I have to watch, and this is true, I've tried a bunch. So if anyone else knows one, a tool that can generate images without bias, please let me know, because Copilot still generally, if I say manager, I get a white male in a suit. That's what I get. I have to tell
when
it.
I've been generating, you got to tell it there.
You've got to say, I want a diverse, and if you say a diverse group, it'll go the other extreme, and there's no white people in the whole picture, which, sorry, white people are part of diversity too, and so you have to, I find lots of repeats, lots of redos with any image generator. So I tend to just not even ask for people in the images that AI produces, if I can help it. And I'll ask instead for a metaphorical representation of something, like instead of like a classic clip art of people collaborating, I'll say, draw a picture of what collaboration looks like without any people. And so it'll be maybe shapes mixing together or something. And then you can find some really cool things. I did have a fun thing that happened when I was doing a project management class, and I wanted a picture of a human project manager using AI, sort of moving things around with AI. So I asked Copilot to do that. And of course, the first couple were all just typical men in suits. Sorry, guys, you're wonderful, but I don't always want a man in a suit. And I finally said, I don't want the human. Just show me the project plan and indicate that AI has been part of this process. And it still gave me the human, but what it did was it changed the human to a tiny little figure and put it in the middle of the project plan. And I thought, that's actually perfect, and I didn't even ask for it. So just be open to surprises when it comes to that, because they're going to be there. And sometimes because it's using that predictive, what's the most likely match between what I can give this person and what she's asked for, sometimes you get things you weren't even thinking of. And sometimes they're better. A lot of times they're not, but when they're better, be ready to take it.
I think we have time for maybe one more question, just quick there. And I've seen, it seems to be jumping back and forth when I've been seeing newsletters. Oh, well, so it's better this about programming. One way asked, is there any particular tool you've saw that was better? I don't know that you write this, but for writing SQL statements, those are database programming statements.
My guess would be ChatGPT, just because of what I know with it for more mundane things like Excel spreadsheets, but honestly, not being a programmer myself and loving that I don't have to be to get what I need out of these tools anymore, I would have to refer you to someone else for that. But I will say, if you have a specific question, we're all colleagues, and that's one reason why I love this community you guys have built here. Send me an email or reach out to me on LinkedIn, and I will research it. There's a very good chance I could find the answer to that question, but I don't want to, speculate and not be right. And so maybe I'll ask Claude what the answer to that question is. But
so I did a little quick search in the background here. I hope my typing isn't too loud. And it turns out there are actually some recommended very specific SQL related AIs that get mentioned in some of their search results. So it might even be effective to go beyond the big names that we all know currently.
Yeah.
In this,
Chris, you might want to share the result of that search in the show notes or something. I think that'd be great.
Yeah, and a lot of people have built tools where they've trained either chat or you sometimes don't even know behind the scenes to culture it or train it to be better at that. So.
At a specific, very task specific, and that's where and I know I blew through a lot of theory very quickly, but specificity versus flexibility was one of those comments I made about the brain versus an AI. And that is its gift and its potential limitation is that specificity. So if you can really zoom in on it, just need it to do this, then you can build something far more effective than these general purpose AIs at that one thing. And that's a perfect example of that, Chris. So thank you for sharing that.
It's kind of the, the screwdriver versus the Swiss Army knife, right?
Right.
Sometimes the more focused tool is going to actually do the better job. A generalized tool is good maybe in a pinch, but
Yeah. And unfortunately, we humans, our brains are programmed for the path of least resistance. So we would all prefer to just have a Swiss Army knife and use it for everything and not have to recognize the nuances of this tool versus that tool, unless it's our profession to do so. So as learning professionals, we do need to recognize and sometimes fight against our own brains and our own tendency, because your brain is lazy. It has to be. It has too much to do. So I just want to remind you guys that here are some of those papers that I suggested, and here's some links to connect to me. Please join me on LinkedIn. I've got some courses on LinkedIn. I've got courses on ATD. And I have a newsletter. I'd like to have you follow me. And I've got a couple of books. Also on my website, you can ask questions about my books, and my chatbot will answer them. And that's it. I want to thank Domino very much for having me, and everybody for joining us. And I know you guys have a few little things you have to do to wrap up.
Yeah. Margie, first off, thank you so much for joining us. As always, you bring so much to a conversation around this stuff. And we're looking forward to seeing where your mind takes you in this pathway next. Hey, folks, don't forget, Instructional Designers in Offices Drinking Coffee is brought to you by Domino. Hit us up on the website if you want to learn more about what we do and see how we might be able to help you out in your L&D world. Hey, thanks everybody for joining us this week. We look forward to our next conversation in 2 weeks' time. And until then, let's dance on out of here, gang.
Yeah.